All right, I am joined by Joseph Chen, the creator of Fantastic Factories, and he just did his first Kickstarter, and it was a big success for in terms of kickstarting. And it's a dice placement engine building game, and you raised over $160,000 across 4,387 backers, which is amazing. And one of the great things about your success is all of the playtesting you did, the demoing that you did at conventions, and that's what we're here to talk about. So we're going to talk about a couple of things about playtesting, how you playtested Fantastic Factories, and then we'll go to questions from social media. So, Joseph, do you have anything else to add about you and your game?
Yeah, I just want to mention it's not just a solo endeavor. It's also my co-designer Justin Faulkner helped me out quite a bit. It's always great to have someone else to like bounce ideas off of and rely on for giving you perspective when you're designing games. So wanted to make sure he got credit as well.
Cool. And you did all of the art, and then but both of y'all made the design. Is that correct?
Yep, yep, that's
And did
great.
he help you with the playtesting? I assuming.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, it helps too if you have a co-designer when you can play test, together really easily
That's
over and over.
perfect.
So,
So I'm making a card game right now, and my little brother, he's kind of that role for me. He's not so much into the design, but he's definitely my playtesting board, and he'll give me feedback on the design. So he's kind of a designer. um, but let's start off with what do you look for during your playtest session? That's one of the things that you brought up.
yeah, so the thing playtesting is actually kind of a broad uh topic in the sense that your game can be at a lot of different stages during playtests, early on or late, and your goals are going to differ depending on how far along you are.
So let's say you
Um,
just made the prototype. What do you
mhm.
look like? What do you look for when you're playtesting with your co-designer?
Yeah, so in kind of that environment where everyone understands it's like the first iterations, the just the sorry, initial birth of the game, just to see if it works. Well, a couple things. Is it fun? Does it work? Is it completely broken? And I think the thing to note is that the first prototype you make should be on like just like scraps of paper, pen and paper, if possible, and that way you don't feel invested in your prototype. And I like to my favorite thing to do is make changes to the game as you're playing it.
I
And
do that too.
and that's one of those things that is really helpful to be playtesting at first with like your co-designers, other designers, people who understand how the game design process works, because they don't get invested in like, oh, I was winning, why are you changing the rules? Like, well, you change the rules because you're trying to design the game. You're not, the goal isn't to win the game, the goal is to test it out, see if it's fun at all in the first place. That's
That's an
kind of the Yeah, I think that's kind of the first version of what you should be doing for your
And then
prototype.
once you feel comfortable with it, you start taking it to conventions and then playtesting. Or is there a step in between,
I
somewhere
mean,
in between there?
there are a number of iterations, and it depends on the game, the complexity of the game, and how comfortable you are with showing the game. For us, I think it was like 6 months before we took it out to public playtesting, and I think we definitely could have gotten there a little faster. I think playing a game prototype is one of those things that, for me, I thought people weren't interested in doing it, and I would have trouble finding an audience who'd be willing to kind of try some like, prototype. And it depends on the community. Here in Seattle, we've got a great organization called Playtest Northwest, who attract players who know what they're getting into. They know that they're play testing a game that may or may not be complete,
That's
and so
awesome.
it's actually a really welcoming environment for that. So I didn't discover Playtest Northwest until about 6 months into the game design, and at the time before then, I would just meet weekly with a close group of friends, and we would play the game a couple times every week. I'd go back, make some tweaks, and then by the time I had gotten the game to a public playtest, I already had some placeholder art, which is what I'm saying is you could definitely get to the table with public playtesting a lot earlier than I did.
Cool. So like right now, it's interesting hearing you say that. Right now, I'm at that point where it's me, my brother, my mom, a couple of my close friends, and they kind of understand the process. And that's what I'm doing. I'm doing those play tests. It's been probably 2 months since I created this idea. And in Austin, where I live, we have a good group like that. I haven't actually been to their events, but I hear about them and I'm part of their groups on Facebook. So I probably should start looking to reaching out to that group and exchanging play tests. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like that would be helpful. I'm kind of getting closer and closer to that 6 months in. And as you said, you probably could have started earlier. So I'll look to do that. But
Yeah, and every group has a different dynamic. It might be helpful to go and attend some of those meetups and to see what other people are bringing at what stage of polish. Like what's the expectation. Because I know I have a weekly designer meetup, and since we meet weekly, people will bring like anything, just like they'll make a game on the spot even, and like this kind of like,
that
well, I
sounds
want to
fun.
try this idea out, and yeah, it just depends on like the group dynamic. How frequently do you meet, and are they all game designers, and that
Cool.
kind of thing.
So after you get comfortable with that and you're wanting to play test it to someone that's never heard of your game or someone that isn't interested in game design, they just want to play a fun game, what do you do? This is pre-published, but you're still.
Hmm.
Do you go to conventions? Where do you go first of all, or where did
So
you go?
once again, it's the fortunate that we have Playtest Northwest. They have weekly events at local games shops that let you basically sign up for the event and say, I'm playtesting this game. People will come by. A lot of support from the local game shops, actually, where like if you playtest a game, they'll give you like a coupon for like 10% off a purchase or something like that. And we're fortunate enough to have that organization, Playtest Northwest. I've seen other game shops do a more localized one, like specifically for that shop. And so if like these kind of organizations don't exist in your area, it's possible if you and a group of designers want to push it forward, you can form your own kind of playtesting organization. Um, Outside of that, I think conventions are a great place to do that, but they come far and few between. And depending on where you live, that may or may not be an easy option.
How far did you travel for conventions to play test your game?
So we're lucky to have quite a few gaming conventions in this area. I won't list them all, but there's a few in like Seattle, some in Portland, Vancouver. Sorry, this is not clear. I'm
Oh,
based
it's
in
okay.
Seattle, uh, and I have also traveled to like PAX South and PAX Unplugged as well.
Oh, cool. That's in my neck of the woods, Pac South, San
Yeah.
Antonio. It's about an hour and a half from where I live. So I've been there a couple times. It's really fun. That's
Yeah.
actually where I met Gerald.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
he's. Oh no, he's in Ohio. Yeah. Um, but yeah, yeah, Gerald, I think attends most of the PAXs. I think, if not
So
all of
you've
the ones.
traveled far. Seattle to Texas
Yeah.
is far, and all
Yeah.
the local conventions you could find.
Mm. But
Um,
local, is the easiest and the cheapest, of course. But for a long time, we just did the weekly meetups with Playtest Northwest, and it's
nice.
also a great way to build an audience as well.
So building your audience, that's kind of where I was going next. So what was your strategy for building an audience and the actual playtest once you went to the conventions and you're showing people that have never seen you or uh,
Hmm.
your game. So how did you build that audience, and what was just your strategy, I guess, in general?
Uh, so if you're playtesting, I basically my goal is always to build a mailing list. My impression is that the mailing list is your most valuable kind of resource in terms of building an audience. Uh, and so after playtesting, I would say like, well, if you want to hear more news about when the game might be available, I'm building out a mailing list. So if you're interested, feel free to sign up. And it's actually a kind of slow way of doing it if your game is a longer game or not a super short game. So like Fantastic Factories typically takes an hour for new players to play. So you're only collecting, like 4 emails each hour. But the thing is, you're playtesting anyways. So you might as well see if you can collect some emails while you're doing it.
It's just upside. That sounds good.
Yeah, and so you should be playtesting your game. Might as well try to collect some emails while you're at it. I won't, since we're talking about playtesting, I won't dive too deep into it. But like conventions, local conventions are a great way to do it. If you're demoing the game, doing like short 10-minute demos rather than 1 hour playtests, that's also a great way of getting emails.
Did you do a lot of shorter demos for your playtests?
Well, I wouldn't call it playtesting, but it depends on the convention. So at like PAX South, we had a really great spot. We were part of the indie showcase, so lots of high traffic, and we were focused on basically getting through as many people as possible. And so we developed a 10-minute demo specifically for that convention. And we've used it since then for a number of places, like the Indie Mega Booth at PAX West. But for most part, when we're playtesting, we focus on playtesting and collecting emails afterwards.
Cool. So your normal demo is the full game, but if you have so much traffic, which is a good thing, then you do the shorter version. That makes sense.
Yeah, and it depends on the context and the situation. If it's a showcase, you're there to like show off the game, then usually I'll do shorter demos. Cool. Or if it's slow traffic, then I'll let people play full games. Ideally, you can do both. Like you split half your table for full games, and for people who just can't play, stick around for that long, or to attract more people, you have the 10-minute demo as well, and that's where it helps to have someone helping out at the table as well.
Cool. This I'm going to go to a question that we had on social media because it kind of relates to one of the things we wanted to talk about. Zachary asked, how important is the presentation of your prototype to playtesters? Well, that's the first question, so we'll start with that.
So there's actually a number of different angles and factors for that. I think the first thing is people will inevitably be drawn to nicer looking games, I think, or better presentation. That's where having like a nice table sign really helps, especially for people who maybe aren't that familiar with playtesting. They're just passing by your table and like, what's going on here? And when you're in the middle of the game, it's kind of hard for them to get a context of what's going on. That's where a table sign kind of describing your game, a little bit of art or something like that. I'm not suggesting people commission art.
What was the lowest level of like art that you had for going to a convention?
The first convention where I brought the game was PAX West, and I did have a little bit of art, but that's because I did the art myself, and I was still kind of learning how to do the art well. And I did have a table sign. I had this funny looking cube sign thing. I actually don't know where it is now, but it helps to have basically at least tell people at a glance what the game's about. And I like to also put in some details like how many players and how long, so people kind of know what they're getting into before they get started.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So yeah, basically a more polished prototype will help bring people to your table, but your game is going to be at different stages depending on how far along you are. And I think the other important thing to consider is that when they are playtesting, the polish of your prototype will affect what kind of feedback you get. If it's just scraps of paper, people will be much more willing to give you big changes. They'll suggest like, I think this doesn't work at all, you should scrap this, whatever, But if you have a very polished looking prototype, people are less likely to tell you about big sweeping changes, and they're more likely to nitpick like your graphic design, for instance.
That's interesting.
Like, why is this icon over there? Or this icon could be a little brighter. And like, depending on like what you're looking for, like maybe you want to test out mechanical changes, or maybe you don't want to test out graphic design. So if your intent is not to test the graphic design of your game, then it might be better to not spend a huge amount of time doing it, because the more polished your prototype looks, the more people will hone in on the smaller details and less on the bigger things because they think the larger things have already been set in stone because you've invested that much time. And so that time investment is a signal to playtesters as to how far along they believe your game is in development and how much impact they think they'll be able to, or how much change they think they'll be able to affect.
That's kind of
So,
cool.
so you want your prototype to at least that level polish to match the level of completion your game is at as well.
Cool. So, but have you seen game designers take like the scraps, like a paper like this, like just handwritten cards? Do you see that very often, or is it mostly like this type of game, but with placeholder art, so it at least looks like kind of a game, you know?
I think it depends on the event and the setting. At conventions, I find that people they try to put a little more effort into it, but I very often see exactly what something. I think at conventions I usually see printed stuff like what you showed me with placeholder art. Actually, is very common.
Huh. Cool. So I'm pretty close.
Yeah, and it always depends on what path you're going down because some people will go self-publish and they'll do the Kickstarter thing, which means they do have art, or at least they are going down that path where they may have some art to show. But if your plan is to stay a designer and pitch to publishers, then you'll have placeholder art. You won't be hiring artists yourself, and so that's very normal.
Cool.
But it's true that you may not get as much buzz, as much traffic as you might otherwise. People are just drawn to things that look a little nicer and a little more complete. But it also depends on a playtester. Some people love being able to like make changes to the game on the fly. You know, some people really like that kind of thing.
That's cool. That's kind of what I tend to do is like, oh, I don't like this. I want to pencil this change in right now with this card in my hand because I don't like the way it reads or how it works. I want to talk about feedback, a couple of questions like how to collect the right feedback and how to respond to that feedback. So just what are your thoughts on that? I haven't really play tested to people I don't know very much, so I don't know a lot about this subject.
Well, usually when I do a playtest, I have a specific goal in mind. Like I made this recent change. I want to see how players react to it. Maybe it's a mechanical change, maybe it's a graphic design change, or whatever it is. Usually you want to go into a playtesting session with a particular goal in mind in terms of, I want to see how people deal with this new change. I will ask for general feedback just to see like, what did you think about this? And then I'll drill into like specifics. Like I'm curious about how you felt about this new mechanic I introduced. The key thing to know is that you're mostly looking for problems and issues and not asking specifically for solutions from players. A lot of playtesters will offer you solutions like, I think you should add this one thing, or I think you should change this one thing, which some designers really hate that, but I don't mind it. But at the same time, what I'm really looking for is what the core issue is. Usually when someone is saying you should change this, what they're implying is you have this problem and they're suggesting a solution to that problem. And that solution may or may not be the right solution. And as a designer, most of the suggestions I've received, I've either tried or considered and basically decided not to do that. It's very rare that I get a suggestion that I can actually use. So what you're looking for are identifying problems, because playtesters are generally very good at finding problems in games in the sense that like I didn't like this part of the game or this part of the game didn't feel like it worked. And so focusing on what the problems were and less on what the solutions are. But at the same time, when people give you a solution, you want to resist the urge to tell them why it doesn't work. Because, like a lot of times, like I said, you've either done it or you've decided that it wasn't a good idea. And, most people will have the urge to explain themselves. Like, okay, I tried that. It didn't work. But playtesters like to feel like they're being heard and that their ideas are being aren't just simply being rejected. So there are times where it's kind of a, well, this sounds really negative, but like a smile and nod sort of thing. Like, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, and then you kind of move on, because what you're really trying to get at is what they think are the problems.
How,
Yeah.
how I've kind of, in my limited time of playtesting, and I'm a social worker by trade, so I have to interpret a lot of communication in different ways and try to understand what people are actually trying to say versus what they're telling me. And whenever I would give playtests to people I didn't really know, and they would give me these type of solutions, is what we'll call them. So when they're telling me solutions to the problems, I usually we'll ask them more questions and try to dig deeper as to what problem are they trying to solve. Like, was it the end game? Did the end game stink? Was it not excitable? Or, I try to ask them questions to kind of pursue that hidden why they're saying that. So I kind of go with what you did in that, just like dig deeper towards the root of their solution. Why are they telling me this solution, as opposed to, okay, I'll add your solution to my game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Let's do the second part of Zachary's question. He says, do you ever run into instances, so whenever you're playtesting your game initially, obviously you and your co-designer, you had a lot of experience with the game, you made up the rules, and Zachary's wanting to know, how do you deal with having unfair advantages over other playtesters? How do you mitigate that, or did you just only playtest it with your co-designer and then have people that haven't played playtest each other, or what did you do about that?
That's a fun question, because I think there are a lot of kind of things to consider with that. It depends a little bit on the game, I think. And you might also consider that it's very much a real world scenario where one player, it could be much more experienced and skilled at the game than the other. I think it's very common for one person at the table to know the game and is teaching it to other people at the table. And so that could be a test of like, how well does your game hold up in that scenario? I'm not saying that every game needs to hold up in that kind of scenario, but what we did notice was, at first, there was certainly a runaway leader problem, in the sense that I felt like I needed to actually hold back. And that is a possibility. As a designer, you could hold back for the sake of kind of playing out the game. And once again, it comes down to your goals during the playtest. Is your goal to see how a normal game where people with similar skill levels are playing, or maybe you want to test it out, see how it is when there is a runaway leader problem, or if there is a runaway leader problem.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and so for a while I would actually hold back because the game is also paced based on how well people do. Like, the game will end earlier if you score better. Players who don't score as well, the game length has more rounds to allow people to build up their engine. So the Fantastic Factories is an engine building game. You naturally want to hit that kind of that arc where you get the engine up and running, run it for a turn or two, and then the game ends. And so the game length is variable in that sense, depending on how quickly people can get their engines running. So so that was interesting to me, where there was a perceived runaway leader problem. And I actually made a fairly big design change in order to try to deal with that. And afterwards, I found that if I played at my best ability, people didn't mind. So once I've solved that, basically it revealed a problem with the game where people thought there was a runaway leader and they couldn't do anything about it. And once I kind of solved that problem, I felt like I could play as well as I could, and people didn't mind losing the game. And
they always felt like they had a chance or something.
Well, not even that, actually.
It was just fun.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. People, even if they lost by a significant amount, they had fun playing the game. And I don't think that's necessarily the right solution for every game, but
it's better than the alternative.
Yeah, for Fantastic Factories, it's less about the competition and more about discovering these kind of cool interactions between factories. And I found that one of the changes I did was I removed the scoring track, which sounds like a really weird change to do, but it actually removed the focus from who's in the lead and brought the focus back to what I thought is core fun of the game, is discovering these engines, running your engine, and that puzzle aspect.
Building the coolest factory.
Yeah. And so I think that by basically making that change, I no longer had to hold back, and people didn't mind. So it was an interesting test of kind of like how fun the game is, even if you don't win. But once again, I want to say that that's not necessarily a solution for every game. One other thing you can do, and what I like to do, is when I play the game, I'll often see what I perceive to be the optimal strategy. But sometimes I'll go off the beaten path. Like, okay, I like building really tight, small engines, but this time I'm going to go just build a bunch of stuff. Or I'll try these 2 factories. I think this car is bad, but, I haven't played it enough to really know for sure.
I'll try to break it.
I'll try it, yeah. I'll see. Basically, I'll try out new strategies that I haven't tried before. And oftentimes it won't be as good as what I perceive to be the optimal strategy.
It sounds like a well-designed game to me. That's kind of what I do with a bunch of games. It's like, all right, I know how to win, but now I want to see if these other options to victory are viable or not.
Yeah,
so it sounds to me like a good design.
Yeah, and it's a good way to playtest, because then you try out things that you hadn't tried before. And I forget who said it, but it's a very good point where once your game gets released to the public, on the first day that people get the game, your game is going to be played more times than it's ever been played in the last 3 years of development on the first day, right? Because I have 4,000 backers. Let's just say like even 10% of them play it within the first day. That's like 400 games, and that's maybe roughly how many times I played the game, and that'll happen in one day. And so
That's crazy.
whatever strategies you've tried, you better have hopefully covered the gamut of like what is possible, because everyone's going to be doing that. If you haven't played it, someone else will, and if they discover something broken, then that's not good for the game. So it's important that when you play test too, that you are trying something different than you've ever tried in order to get more data as well. So just by doing that, oftentimes maybe you won't be playing at your optimal. So that's kind of another way of holding back. You're kind of holding back, but you're still playing at your best of abilities, with the caveat that you are trying out a new strategy that you haven't tried before.
Cool. Well, I'm going to go to some more social media questions. We got a couple of those. Chris asked, I think we already answered this, but what are the best ways to find frequent playtesting opportunities if you don't have a regular group? And you mentioned local conventions, in your area at least, local game stores opening up. So that one's good. And then Justin asked,
I want to add a little bit more to that.
Yeah.
Like, maybe it's very likely that you aren't fortunate to have conventions or organization. You can always just talk with your local game shop and see if they'll organize some kind of event, or you could just set up on one of their tables, get a table sign, get like a looking for players kind of sign, and like just random people sometimes will be interested and come by. And just be interested. And
that's
so
cool.
that's
I might actually do that. I have 2 days off tomorrow and anyway through the rest of the week. And I've been debating. I'm kind of nervous about it. I don't know if I will actually do it, but I've been debating kind of something like that. Just going and sitting with my prototype and just kind of looking for players who wants to play this half-made game.
And it's tricky because sometimes that can be a lonely endeavor. Sometimes
that's what I'm worried about. Just 4 hours of like, okay.
I would say bring something else to do in case no one comes. But like, when your game needs to be play tested. So when you don't have those more convenient options, you have to do what you have to do.
Did you use digital playtesting like Tabletopia or Tabletop
Yeah,
Simulator?
I was actually just about to mention
Oh,
that.
okay.
We playtested quite a bit on Tabletop Simulator. For us, we specifically played with people we did know. Like we had friends who actually just lived in different cities.
Okay.
Um, and actually, used it a lot when my son was born, and basically had to stay home most of the time. But
Makes
while
sense.
he's like napping, like fire up a game. So it's
That's perfect.
convenient to being able to do it from the comfort of your own home.
Was it relatively easy to set up your game? Or was that a little
Uh,
tricky?
there is a it's It's definitely doable, but there is definitely a learning curve, and the tools are not super great. And there's also a learning curve for using Tabletop Simulator.
Ah,
But it's once you get once you get going, it's pretty nice. It's pretty convenient. And from what I understand, there is a community of people on Tabletop Simulator who are willing to try out new games. So you could potentially they have a little chat room.
oh,
You could
that's good.
say, like, hey, anyone interested in playtesting this game, as long as you kind of let them know up front what they're getting into, people are, I think, from what I've heard, are willing to try out new games on Tabletop Simulator.
Well, that's exciting. All right, and then we'll go to Justin asks, what's the most efficient ways to make changes to the information of your prototype? So how do you, after you have your initial prototype and you want to update it, do you use something like Nandeck or InDesign, or how did you do your cards?
Once again, it depends on like the level of polish on your prototype. If you anticipate a lot of changes,
Uh-huh.
and pen and paper, I'll just scribble on the card and I'll write something over it. For me specifically, after I got to that stage, I so to actually track updates to like digital copies of the card. I didn't use anything too fancy like Nandeck. I haven't tried it, but and maybe
There's a learning curve.
and maybe here in Nandeck you kind of need to be comfortable coding, from what I've heard.
You don't now. You used to. When I started like 8 years ago, you pretty much had to hard code it. But now they
Oh.
have a kind of drag and drop. I actually made these. I'm showing the cards again, but I made these in Nandeck. I had a Google sheet in Nandeck, and then the best part is I filled out the Google sheet with this information, and then whenever I have an update, I just like hit 2 buttons to print them out in Nandeck. I have a video on how I did it, but it's not too bad nowadays. But before they implemented one of their newer features called the visual editor, it was definitely hard coding and something I could not do for the longest time.
Mm-hmm. For me, I'm not sure I would recommend what I end up doing. I didn't do anything too fancy. I did everything in Illustrator actually,
Uh-huh.
and I would there's a option called place file or place image, and so I would place icons onto the cards, and so every card I have is actually a mix of various placed images. So like the layout in general is a placed image. So if I ever want to change the look of the layout, I just have to change the placed file, and then it'll update it for all my cards. But the thing is, it only changes the look. It doesn't change the positioning or the numbers or anything like that. And so if I were to do some balance tweaks, I would have to go into each file and like change each number individually, which I think is probably a lot more work than Nandeck. But
if you I have like a 15-minute video that is I would say pretty good at explaining all of the things, pretty much what you do in Illustrator, except you don't have to update each file. You just update the spreadsheet and then hit 2 buttons. So if you ever make a new game, you can check it out or not. But it saved me a whole lot of time. And I just
it depends on how many cards I have. I think I might do that.
Yeah, I have like 120 now, and I can't imagine having to handwrite them. I used to do that before I learned Nandeck, and it was just like, I remember the first game I made. I went to play test it, and I was like, oh my goodness, I have to rewrite all of these cards. But that was eye opening.
It depends on how big sweeping the changes need to be.
Yeah. In my games, typically I make a lot of sweeping changes, so that's just the style I I use when designing. It's not probably not the best, but it's just who I am. All right, Michael asks, what issues should I look for during a playtest, and how do you balance? So that first one we kind of covered quite a bit. You in particular, you like to focus on an issue and then ask questions to playtesters like, hey, we're trying to figure out if this balance change works, or this layout thing works. So we kind of covered that. But his second question is, how do you balance asymmetry? Is that how you say that? Asymmetry.
Yeah. So there are a couple ways. So playtesting in general will tell you kind of like over a course of many playtests will kind of inform you as to what the balance might look like. But you also have to consider like the experience level of players. For instance, there could be a particular player power that is maybe trickier to use than others. So like it may be very powerful under the right someone who's experienced at using it. So you have to consider that. For me, when I was balancing cards, I kind of have a rough conversion of like what equivalent values look like.
That's what I just made. I love it. It helps so much.
It's just like, okay, one metal is roughly equal to 2 energy, which is roughly equal to 1 card. So when I'm balancing cards, I kind of use that as a guideline to just set it up. But really, it comes down to playtesting. So like these balancing like equivalents, resource equivalences, help you get to a balanced card faster. But ultimately, you do need playtests to like figure out what makes sense or what doesn't. In terms of just kind of like what you just have to observe it, you know. I think answers a lot of playtesting, unfortunately.
Yeah. So in my experience, I'm making a 2-player tower defense asymmetrical card game, and we have one player is playing the monsters, they're sending monsters, and then one player is playing defense to try to keep them from killing their base. And so in my experience, I was trying to make both sides at once and playtest it. But then I realized, kind of like what you did, I was like, man, this is way too complicated, and the balance keeps getting really off. And so I finally just sat down for like 10 hours, and I was like, okay, I need a conversion system. So I was like, how much damage is worth a card, and how much health is worth a card, and blah, blah, blah. And then I was able to make a lot more balanced cards. And what I've noticed, what I do is I'll focus really hard on the monsters, and I'll update them and try to get them balanced and working better. And then we'll playtest a couple times, and then I'll be like, okay, how can I make the defense better now? And so then I'll focus on that side of the game. So that's how I do it. Again, it's kind of like Joseph said, it's just a lot of playtesting.
Yeah, and I think specifically for balance, it's helpful to get a group of people who are familiar with your game, because then they know kind of first, they can play the game much faster. Second, they know what the pitfalls are and how to basically try to break the game. So for like actual balance, I usually go for an experienced group of players. But at the same time, you still want to playtest with newer players, just to see also what the perceived balance is as well. It's like, just because something is balanced, it's good for your game, because if people perceive it as to be imbalanced, then that is a problem as well.
That's a really good point.
That perception can be just as important as actually being balanced.
It's funny because
if people feel like your game is unbalanced, they're not going to play it the second time. So, you know.
Yeah, and I think I talk about this how the math, the structure of your game, the math is broken. People will play the game and then not have fun, but they won't know why they didn't have fun. But as a designer, I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure you didn't have fun because these cards that you just lost to were way overpowered, or something. And it comes down to that structure, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes like oh well, they're not overpowered. You can use this particular strategy to counter it really easily. But if players can't see that easily, or like they don't pick up on that, then even if it is balanced, the perception of not being balanced can hurt your game.
That makes sense.
And then on the other side, it's important to also not overly balance your game, in the sense that you want your decisions to still matter. You know, I've seen some games that go the complete opposite, where everything's so balanced that it doesn't really matter what you do because every choice gives you the same output, really.
That's
And
interesting.
you have to be careful not to push the other end of the spectrum as well.
I was actually doing that with my design, and Zachary, one of the guys that just asked the question, he was like, well, it is important to have some cards that are more overpowered. You don't want them broken, but more overpowered than others, so that you can find those strategies. And I was like, And he was like, yeah, Magic the Gathering does this in other card games. So
Oh yeah,
like, that makes a
definitely.
lot of sense. And so then I started making a little bit more stronger guys and weaker cards and whatnot, and that helped a
Yeah,
lot
and it
as far
depends
as
on
fun.
the game. It depends on the game design. Some games designs uh, intentionally make cards more powerful than others. Some game designs require you to make each card roughly equivalent. So it just depends. Like Magic the Gathering is definitely one where most rare cards are just are much better than commons,
That makes
and
sense.
that's just part of the drafting process and how the game works. And for Fantastic Factories, I tried to make each card fairly equivalent, but have different value in different contexts. So depending on what strategy you're going, uh, basically this card is much more valuable if you have this other card that complements it well. And so it just depends on the game design. Sometimes card imbalance is part of the game. Sometimes it isn't.
Makes sense. Ben asks, how do you sort out bad feedback and good feedback? So we
Mm.
kind of talked about this already. Like, you're trying to focus on the problem instead of the solution. But do you have some more you want to add to that in your
Yeah,
experience?
that one requires a bit of experience, I think, because it's true. You're gonna get a lot of feedback, and some of it may be applicable, some of it may not be. It's hard to tell sometimes when it's a one-off. It's like, okay, this person complained about this issue. Is it really an issue or is it not? And it comes also back down to that thing you need to consider is that once your game goes out into the wild, you know, thousands of people are gonna play it. So if one person this early on says it's an issue, there's a good chance that it may be an issue with then 100 people or 200 people, depending. It just scales up when more and more people play it. So I take most feedback pretty seriously, but it's possible that a couple things you need to consider that maybe that playtester may or may not have been part of your target audience, and so that maybe lessens the value of that feedback. But it's really tricky to know, like, sort that information out. Like, is this a one-off? Is this from someone who this game isn't really intended for, uh, or is it real feedback? And once again, playtesting. Like, if it is a real issue, likely it will come up again. Once something comes up twice, that definitely gets on my
Red
radar.
flag, yeah.
Yeah, but it's very, very important to not dismiss the first instance. Otherwise, when the second instance comes along, you won't notice it. You might dismiss it in the same way again. So, first time I hear about something, you have to use a little intuition as well. Like, okay, does that sound like a real issue or not? If it is, then maybe I'll do something immediately based off of one person's feedback. If not, then I'll kind of file it away in the back of my mind, saying, okay, well, let's see if someone else thinks it's an issue. Um, and that's where just a big volume of playtesting can help kind of see these problems rise to the top, because, like, oh, 3 people have mentioned it at this point, that sort
And
of
a
thing.
perfect example from my game I've been making, I originally had the monsters would send 2 monsters per turn, and all the monsters were equal. You would have 5 or 6 monsters, and each of them cost 1 resource or whatever you want to say. So the monster player would send 2 monsters in whatever lanes they wanted. And several different people brought up, oh, I wish the monsters had different costs so I had more choices and blah, blah, blah. And at first I was like, yeah, I kind of want to add that too, but I don't really know how to yet. So then the next play test, next person, they're like, same thing. And I was like, okay, I should look in more to how to add this. And then the third person, I was like, okay, I should stop everything and just figure out how to add a new resource system to the monsters. So
Hmm.
that's my real life example of what you're talking about. If maybe that makes it relatable to people. We have a couple more questions from social media. Let's see. We just had bins. All right, Brandon asks how to keep things cost effective, particularly when making a handful of copies. So, did you do reviewer copies? You did.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll start with your prototypes. I guess, did you have any cost saving there, or did you just kind
of? Well, I probably spent more than I needed to.
I definitely have as well. So.
Like I think first time I ordered a nice prototype from like the Game Crafter, I was like, oh, you know what? I'll get like 3 copies because it'll be, like for. I wanted some nice copies, but the thing is, like, depending on how early on in the development, basically as soon as the prototype arrived, it was out of date. So,
that's what mine would do.
So there's a few things you could do. And it, once again, depends on the stage of where your prototype is at. When I'm doing normal prototyping, I usually will just do handwritten things, and so just making changes is just a matter of using pen. If you go to like more digital stuff, like using Nandeck, just like sleeves, and just printing out a new sheet and then just replacing that card. It depends on how big of the change is. If it's still like a small change, I'll just scribble it on.
So the big piece of advice is maybe to wait on the professionally printed games until you're really kind of sure about most of it.
Yeah, and to perhaps not overdo it. I mean, the thing is, like, the first printed prototype I made was for a convention because, like, I knew it was going to a convention and wanted something a little more presentable. It comes back to that. Like, if it looks nicer, more people will come and play. One thing I like doing is I use this service from HP called Instant Ink. It requires the right HP printer, but it's kind of weird. But it's a ink subscription service.
I've read I've had the pop-ups, but I've never done it.
So it's kind of weird. So basically they send you a massive ink cartridge, and they basically own the ink cartridge, and you are paying per page. So like I pay $3 a month, and I get 50 pages to print. And so the print it feels a little like Big Brother-ish. They track how many pages you print.
That's cool. I've never actually known how it worked.
And they report it. And basically, if you unsubscribe, or you stop paying the monthly subscription, they deactivate your ink cartridge, which is kind of...
That's crazy how they can do that.
It's kind of weird, yeah, and it feels a little invasive, but it's actually really cost efficient if you are printing full sheets of cards like I do. So, like, I've got, like, either placeholder art or full art. I'm printing 9 cards per sheet, full color, and I'm paying $3 a month, so I could print out 50 full color sheets of paper, And so, like, if you're printing full color, full sheets every time, then $3 a month is a very cost efficient way of doing it.
Just for reference, like my cards, I'm showing the audience if they can kind of see. I've been printing probably like, I don't know, 5 to 10 sheets a week, updating my game. And I've even started, like, after I have to pay $50 for a new ink cartridge or new set of ink cartridges, I'm like, maybe I should look into a little better way to do this. But that kind of sounds cool, the ink subscription service.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but I think if you do a lot of like a lot of more heavy usage printing, it's actually pretty cost efficient per page. Cool. If you're just printing documents or just black and white, then maybe not so much. But
I might think about it once I start getting my placeholder art and start having a lot more color used on my games.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have one more from Twitter. Sean from Savage Yeti Games. He asks, how do you find kids to help test your kids' games? Because most friendly local gaming stores don't have mini kids there, and like it's kind of, you can't really advertise to kids, or it's just that seems like. Did you what first of all, what's Fantastic Factory's age like?
It's officially 14 plus, but I've had as young as 10 years old. So I can't say that I have much experience in this area, but I can kind of say what I've observed. And where I've seen younger kids is, first there's a library here in Seattle that sets up game days every month. And so that's a great opportunity because libraries will have generally younger audience, especially for games. So like encouraging smaller kids, younger kids to come and play. So potentially there may be library events, or maybe a library will let you host an event or something like that.
That's pretty cool. That's a good idea. I haven't thought of that.
And then I've had some the young crowds I've seen are at like Comic Cons. So we have Emerald City Comic Con here in Seattle, and I've seen a young. That's where I've had my youngest players. I think Comic Cons tend to be more kid friendly than gaming conventions, and so and some Comic Cons will have spots for indie game developers and stuff like that. And so potentially getting one of those tables, you might attract a younger crowd there. So, I mean, outside of that, family and friends, hopefully. If you're designing a kids' games, maybe hopefully you have like nieces, nephews, or friends of kids, that sort of thing that can be helpful.
That makes sense. I really like the library suggestion because I've gone to board game meetups at libraries. And there wasn't many kids that went to the actual meetup, but there's kids there. And if the library's hosting it, that seems like a really good place to go.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's all of our questions from social media. Did you have anything else you wanted to add about the playtesting experience?
I would say one final tip. If you're playtesting, so for my game, we have cards with a lot of icons and details and stuff like that. Oftentimes you'll get a question. You're like, what does this do? Or what does this card, or what does this mean? How does this effect work, or whatever? And most people will be like, okay, I'll just tell you how it works. But one trick I like to do is just ask the player, like, how do you think this works? Or what do you think this means? Because, well, first of all, maybe it's not clear because your iconography or your wording is not clear. That's an issue basically that comes up when people ask you that question. But then at the same time, you have a potential to get some more insight because they'll tell you how they think it works. And how they think it works may or may not match how it actually works. So, sorry. Basically, what I'm saying is that people have certain intuition as to how they think certain mechanics or certain cards should work. And if your card or your rule or mechanic doesn't work the way they think it works, then you might revisit it and say like, well, is there a reason why it doesn't work the way they think it should work? Because you want your game to play intuitively. You want people to implicitly know the rules without having to like, expend a lot of like mental energy to read all the words, if that makes sense. I actually have a lot of people also ask me what does this card do, and I will literally just read the card to them, and that's another indicator that like, okay, maybe there's too much text on the card. So asking people like what they think it does as well is a way to kind of figure out, is your game design intuitive?
That's good. I've done that to my brother. Like he'll ask me like, what's this keyword? And I'll be like, what do you think it means? And I noticed it was kind of bothering him, so I told him why I was doing it. So it wasn't just like, what do you think it means? But then he was like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But I have a funny, like one time not too long ago, I had added this keyword called bravery. And what bravery does, there's three rows where you can put your monsters. If you put a monster in a row by itself, in a lane by itself, it gets its bravery trigger. So that makes sense logically. But whenever I hadn't told him about the keyword, and I forgot I added it since we last played. And he just played the card and did the bravery trigger. And I noticed, I was like, wait, what? How did you know how to do that? So at first I thought, oh, that must be super intuitive, and he just knew how it worked. But he just interpreted it as it's a come into play effect. And I was like, oh. So it's kind of close. But it was kind of eye-opening for me, the designer, to kind of get insight from the player learning about this keyword and how they used it intuitively. So kind of is what you're... Oh, I had one last question, and it was, how do you know when you're done playtesting and you should publish? Because that's like a big thing, especially for me.
That's tricky because you're pretty much never done playtesting. But at some point, you gotta
That's me. I
you gotta
play
push
test
that
until
the
I
door.
break the game.
That's a tough one because, well, for me, there's only a certain distance your design can go, and I think spend a lot of time trying to satisfy. You can't please everyone. I think that's really what it comes down to, and certain designs will appeal to certain players, and I've gotten to the point where some players say like the game's not interactive enough, and so I try to add some more interaction. And when I added that ended up hurting my existing audience. Basically, people who enjoyed the game before enjoyed the game less. And so basically, at a certain point, the changes you make aren't clearly making your game better, if that makes any sense.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
You might be making one group of people happier, but then maybe another group are less happy. And things like small balance tweaks, you'll probably never quite get to the end of that. But once the game is to a point where you think that the fun of the game is being, highlighted, showcased, and any issues that you want to solve all the issues you can solve that are strictly beneficial for your game. Like if changing this icon makes it clear for everyone, that's the kind of change you want to make. If it's making a change that may be controversial in the sense that some people will agree with it, some people won't, then you're starting to approach the point where your game might be good to go, and making changes is just making changes for the sake of making changes, and at that point it's basically ready to push out the door.
My personal experience, just to expand on that, my game is pretty much targeted to trading card game players, people that like Magic the Gathering and Epic card game, just games that I've played all my life. And what I've noticed is I have my brother, he's also a trading card game player, and I'll play test with him and try out some changes and get his feedback. And a lot of times at the beginning, they're like, there's not enough decision making. That was the TCG players' feedback. So I added a lot more decision making, and then I played it with some non-gamers, and they're like, "Whoa, this is kind of complex." And so me as a designer, I immediately wanted to pull it way back, but I was like, "Wait, but that's not my core audience. My core audience is TCG players." So then I decided I'm just going to try to make this game as easy to understand and to get into as possible, while also still pleasing my core audience, which is the trading card game players. Mm-hmm. So that's from my personal experience on that issue. I still have yet to publish a game though, so I don't know what I'll do, when I'll know. But your advice on when you stop making big changes and you're just making really small changes that might not help everybody, I think that's solid advice. So thank you so much for doing this talk. I've learned a lot.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Yeah. It is also nice to get to know you as well. We've talked a bit here and there on social media, but I know you've been busy with the Kickstarter, so you might not have even known it was me. It's coming into some of your conversations. But it's good to see you, Joseph. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.